Bodies piling up in Michigan and Texas. A convicted and confessed murderer almost walks scot-free. I'm your host Kevin, and this is Crime Chronicle. Hello. Today's case is on the Sunday Morning Slasher, aka Carl Eugene Watts. A man who may in fact be the most prolific murderer in American history.
The case of the Sunday Morning Slasher is an interesting one. Carl Eugene Watts, or Coral to those who knew him. Yeah. Anyway, Carl was born on November 7th, 1953 in Killeen, Texas, to parents Richard Eugene Watts, a private first class in the Army, and mother Dorothy Mae Young, a kindergarten teacher at Fort Hood. By the time Carl had reached 2 years of age, his parents had separated, which was when his mother took him from Texas, moving north to settle in Inkster, Michigan. At 9 years old, Carl gained a stepfather when a mechanic named Norman Caesar married his mother, Dorothy Mae. Norman and Dorothy later had 2 daughters together. On a side note, some reports claim Carl to have had a total of 9 siblings, and while this may in fact be the truth, most sources only mention the 2 younger sisters from his mother's marriage to Norman. Things weren't perfect for the family, however. Watts was often described as rather odd and strange by those around him, even as a child. Watts himself later recounted that it was around the age of 12 that he originally began to have violent fantasies about women and girls, involving torture and even death. Hitting that time of puberty, Watts began his trial runs of acting out those fantasies, primarily just stalking girls, and it's also believed that he may have taken his first victim before turning 15. At 13, Watts was held back in the 8th grade at school due to an infection with meningitis, and he was unable to keep up with the other students, receiving failing grades and becoming a favored victim of school bullies. Carl had his first run-in with the law on June 29th of 1969, where he was arrested for S.A. involving 26-year-old Joan Gave, a young woman who lived on the paper route Carl worked. The incident occurred inside Joan's home. Watts was only 15 at the time. Watts was tried and sentenced to a mental hospital, the Lafayette Clinic in Detroit, where upon psychiatric assessment, he was determined to have a delusional thought process, be developmentally disabled. The actual report uses different terminology. However, since this is YouTube, I'd rather not use the exact wording here. With an IQ of 75. Interestingly, though, this diagnosis seems to run contradictory to the statement of the officer who interrogated Carl after his arrest, who described Carl as very, very intelligent and with an excellent memory. Carl was released just a few months later on November 9th, 1969, 2 days after his 16th birthday. Carl still graduated high school with all his failing grades in 1973 with a football scholarship to Lane College in Jackson, Tennessee. Because as we all know, grades don't matter as long as you do sports good. This, of course, only lasted around 3 months as Carl was quickly expelled after multiple accusations of stalking and assaulting women on campus. He was also implicated in the brutal murder of a female student. However, not enough evidence was recovered that could tie him to the crime. Upon expulsion, Carl returned to the state that birthed him, Texas, and settled in Houston. He officially began his career as a serial killer 1 year later in 1974, where he would kidnap his targets from their homes, torture, and then murder them. Gloria Steele was murdered by Watts on October 30th, 1974. She is believed to have been his second victim and was 20 years old at the time of her death. Watts' victims were women between 14 and 44 years of age. He used a variety of methods, including strangulation, bludgeoning, stabbing, and drowning. Watts' activities spanned a total of 8 years and dozens of women. His activity was spread across several law enforcement jurisdictions and states, which, during the period he was active, made it more difficult for authorities to realize they had a serial killer on the loose. In spite of never being arrested in connection to these many murders, he was brought in for questioning for a murder in 1975. Though there had not been enough evidence to convict him, he did, however, spend a year in prison for attacking a woman who survived his assault. Another factor that made it difficult for authorities to identify him as a serial killer was that Watts was apparently not carnally motivated. This means that even though early DNA testing was available at the time, Carl rarely, if ever, left any behind. It was believed that in October of 1975, Carl had also crossed the Canadian border, assaulting 20-year-old Sandra Dahl, leaving her near death outside her apartment in Windsor. Around this time, Watts had fallen under scrutiny of homicide investigators, and a task force was formed in July of 1980, charged with probing the Sunday slashings, with Watts being put under sporadic surveillance. And by November, officers had gained a court order to place a homing device in Watts' vehicle. At some point after 1974, Watts moved back to Michigan, where he lived until 1981. He then moved back to Texas again. During this time, Watts' personal life had a few developments. He married his first wife, Valeria Goodwill, in 1979, though this was short-lived and they were divorced in 1980. Watts then married an unnamed woman and had one unnamed child with them before again divorcing. On May 23, 1982, Watts was arrested after breaking into the home of two women, Belinda Aguilar and Lori Lister. He choked Lister into unconsciousness as she returned home from work and attempted to do the same to Aguilar as well, though Aguilar feigned unconsciousness as Watts used a wire to tie her hands behind her back. As Watts dragged Lister up to the bathtub to drown her, Aguilar broke free from her bonds and jumped out a window for help. Watts at some point realized Aguilar had escaped and attempted to flee the scene, though he was soon caught by police, and thankfully Lister had been saved. In Michigan, Watts was the suspect for the murders of 10 women and girls. Texas prosecutors were not confident the amount of evidence they had was enough to convict Watts for murder, so instead they arranged for a plea bargain. Watts was to give full details and confessions of his actions and in exchange gain immunity from the murder charges. Instead, he'd face the much lesser charge of burglary with intent to murder, a charge that only carried with it a 60-year sentence, which he agreed to and confessed to 12 murders in Texas. Michigan wasn't happy with that deal, so authorities refused to participate in it, leaving the cases in that state still open. Watts was sentenced to the agreed-upon 60 years. Though in a truly baffling move, the Texas Court of Appeals ruled that Carl had not been informed that the bathtub and water he attempted to drown Lori Lister in was considered a deadly weapon, which reclassified him as a non-violent felon and made him eligible for early release. To top it off, Texas law at the time allowed non-violent felons to have 3 days deducted from their sentence for every 1 day served for good behavior. I want that to sink in. The man had already confessed to 12 murders in the state of Texas, and due to a technicality, was reclassified as a non-violent felon. Now, I don't care what kind of shenanigans you're trying to pull on the legal side here. If somebody has confessed to multiple murders at that point, I don't care if they're using a Beanie Baby as their weapon of choice. Like, it makes no sense to me whatsoever. He had already confessed to 12 murders at that point. 12 murders. Are you kidding me? I'm getting off script now. Carrying on. Watts was very well behaved in prison and had enough time deducted from his sentence to be released 37 years early. This naturally led to public outcry, resulting in the law being abolished. However, that could not be applied retroactively due to the Texas Constitution. Michigan Attorney General Mike Cox went on national TV in 2004 asking for anyone with information that could lead to the conviction of Carl Watts to come forward in order to guarantee the violent murderer would not walk free. Watts had no immunity from any murder charges in Michigan, so when Joseph Foy of Westland, Michigan came forward to say he had witnessed a man fitting Watts' description murder 25-year-old Helen Dutcher on December 1st, 1979, Watts was promptly charged. Dutcher had been stabbed more than 12 times, and Foy had identified Watts by his evil eyes that were devoid of emotion. The trial judge was asked by law enforcement officials to allow the Texas confessions into evidence, which he agreed to before Watts' 2004 trial began. On November 17, 2004, after hearing Joseph Foy's eyewitness testimony, a Michigan jury convicted Watts of the murder. He was sentenced to life imprisonment on December 7th, and 2 days later, Michigan authorities began making moves to try Watts for the 1974 stabbing death of Western Michigan University student Gloria Steele. This second Michigan murder trial began on July 25, 2007 in Kalamazoo, Michigan, with closing arguments taking place the next day on July 26th, and the jury returning a guilty verdict the following day. Sentencing for Watts took place in September 13th, where he received life imprisonment without parole, though he wouldn't end up serving much longer than a week, as on September 21st, 2007, he died of prostate cancer in a Jackson, Michigan hospital. Carl Watts was a sick individual, a true piece of human garbage that never should have been let out of the mental hospital. Prior to his Texas sentencing, Watts was diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder, which is sometimes called sociopathy. This mental disorder causes the afflicted to show no regard for right or wrong, and ignore the rights and feelings of others. This is absolutely no excuse, in my opinion, for his heinous actions, as approximately 3% of men and 1% of women have the condition, live with it every day, and do not become killers. While in prison, Carl admitted to murdering 40 women and implied to have about 80 victims in total. Watts wouldn't outright confess to these murders, as he did not want to be considered a mass murderer. To this day, Watts is suspected to have killed more than 100 women, which, if true, would make him the most prolific serial killer in American history. With that kind of body count, I feel the term mass murderer definitely applies. Don't you?
So that was the tale of the Sunday morning slasher, Carl Eugene Watts. Thank you for watching Crime Chronicle. If you enjoy this kind of content, please hit that like button. And if you'd like to keep notified on any future uploads, why don't you go ahead and hit that subscribe button as well. We're currently on a monthly upload schedule, however, that could change in the near future. So if you want to keep up to date on all future uploads, go ahead and why don't you hit that bell and turn on all notifications. If you have any suggestions for any cases that you would like to see profiled on the channel, why don't you go ahead and leave them down in the comments below. Or even if you just want to say hi, always like to read through that kind of thing. I just want to say thank you to everybody who watches this. Please stay safe out there, and I will see you in the next video.